They told me never to repeat this story. In fact, the records themselves were supposed to have been burned, the testimonies sealed away under church authority and medical decree. Yet some fragments survived, whispered in the cracks of archives no one dares touch. It begins in Massachusetts, 1847, an era when the town physician was the highest authority next to the minister, when science and scripture fought silently over the same corpses. In that winter, a name appeared in both ledgers, Latoya. She was only 17, the daughter of a fisherman who had drowned the previous spring, and a mother who had withdrawn into silence so absolute that neighbors swore she had forgotten language altogether. Latoya was brought to the doctor because she had stopped sleeping, stopped eating, and claimed that something had taken root inside her, something she could not kill nor expel. Within hours, physicians would wish they had never opened her door. What they saw that night left them broken men, unwilling to speak again, some turning to alcohol, others to prayer, a few even fleeing the town itself. And yet, when you hear it now, you will understand why. You will see why a case file vanished, why the church locked away entire journals, and why a girl's name was erased from stone. Because Latoya's story is not just a haunting. It is a blueprint, a glimpse of how fear is used as a tool of control, how the human mind can be broken and rewritten, and how the line between medical science and spiritual warfare was never as clean as they wanted you to believe. Tonight, you are not just hearing a ghost story. You are stepping into a secret chamber of history, one where the walls themselves still bleed if you listen long enough. The house where Latoya lived was small, 2 rooms, its wood swollen from Atlantic storms, its windows layered with frost. By the time the doctor arrived, the candlelight inside barely held against the winter dark. Latoya sat in a chair, rigid, her hands clenched so tight that the nails had grown inward, cutting her own flesh. Blood seeped in tiny crescents across her palms. The doctor noted this in his journal, but then stopped because she began to speak. Not in English. Not in Latin, but in something that sounded like both and neither. A tongue that carried rhythm but no mercy, as though an older presence was using her body as a cracked instrument. Her mother sat in the corner, rocking, whispering the same prayer again and again, but not to God. No, she whispered to her dead husband, pleading with him to hold her down. When the doctor approached, Latoya's eyes rolled back, showing nothing but white. The witnesses claimed that her chest rose and fell at impossible speed, that her bones rattled as though trying to leap from her skin. A second doctor arrived, summoned in haste, and together they restrained her arms. But this is where the case crossed into what no textbook could ever explain. Because when they held her still, a third hand emerged, thin, pale, reaching from beneath her ribcage. The men screamed, but the hand withdrew as quickly as it had appeared. They wanted to believe it was hallucination, some trick of candlelight, yet each man saw it and each man swore it was real. This was not illness. This was invasion. And that meant, by the doctrines of 1847, they were no longer dealing with medicine, but with possession. But possession by what? That was the question that would destroy them. You see, Massachusetts in the mid-19th century was still haunted by another memory, the Puritan trials, the fires of accusation, the echo of gallows wood. To whisper of possession was to invite ruin upon the town itself. Yet the doctors, though trained in science, were not immune to those shadows. They wrote in their private notes, not the public ledgers, that Latoya's case bore resemblance not to madness, but to what Cotton Mather had once chronicled in hushed sermons, an invisible contagion of the spirit. The most disturbing detail, however, was Latoya's knowledge. She began speaking names. Not common names, but the full Christian and family names of men who had been buried in that town long before she was born. She recited sins, adultery, theft, violence, that no girl her age should have known. One doctor dismissed it as coincidence, until Latoya revealed the private shame of his own youth, something buried in silence for 30 years. His face went pale. He left the room and would not return. This is how the corruption began. Because whether you call it demon, spirit, or something else entirely, The force inside Latoya did not just want her body. It wanted to strip open the hidden sins of every man in that town, one by one. And that is the kind of truth that destroys institutions. Not because it kills the flesh, but because it unmasks the rot they spend lifetimes concealing. That is why the doctors never spoke of it. That is why Latoya's file disappeared. But the deeper truth? It goes further than one girl. Latoya was not the first case. She was merely the first one they could not silence without witnesses. What the physicians did not know, at least not yet, was that Latoya's father had not drowned by accident. His body had been found face down in the bay, lungs filled not with seawater, but with something thicker, blacker, like tar. No fisherman had seen him fall, no storm had been recorded that night. His death was declared a tragedy, but in the weeks before it he had been digging, quite literally, beneath the church. He was a laborer, often called upon to reinforce old foundations. And in that dark earth beneath the altar, he had unearthed something wrapped in oilcloth and bones. He spoke of it only once to a neighbor who swore he had seen it. A book swollen with damp, its pages crawling with handwriting that moved as though alive. Days later he was dead. Weeks after that, Latoya began her decline. Coincidence? Or was his daughter simply the next vessel? Understand this. Institutions do not fear the supernatural because it is unexplainable. They fear it because it confirms what they secretly know. That power comes not from sermons, not from medicine, but from control of fear. And Latoya's case threatened to unravel the very currency of their control. The doctors knew if this became public, faith in both church and science would crumble. A girl who could name their hidden crimes? A girl who could name their hidden crimes? A girl who carried an impossible third hand inside her? That was a weapon, not an illness. But no one asked the obvious question. If her father had uncovered the source, had he truly drowned, or was he silenced? By February of 1847, Latoya had wasted to nearly nothing. Her skin clung to her bones, her eyes sunk deep into her skull, and yet her strength was unnatural. Grown men could not hold her when the fits began. She spoke less often now, but when she did, the words came with such precision that the doctors wrote them phonetically, terrified to misrecord a single syllable. They later realized those phrases formed a pattern, a cipher that, when aligned with ancient Hebrew and fragments of Phoenician, translated into something chilling. I remember the debt. Debt. Not curse. Not sickness. A debt owed. But by whom? Was it her family? Her town? Or humanity itself? The doctors could not agree. What they did agree on was this. The case must never reach Boston, never reach the academies, never reach the newspapers. Too much was at stake. They ordered silence. But silence is the perfect soil for corruption. Because while the doctors struggled to contain her, the town began to whisper. Farmers claimed their livestock had stopped producing milk after hearing her voice carried on the wind. Children woke with scratches across their backs, scratches that matched the crescent wounds in Latoya's own palms. And as the rumors spread, one fact became undeniable. This was no longer Latoya's burden alone. Whatever had taken root in her was spreading. And once fear takes root, it becomes unstoppable. When the first priest was called to Latoya's home, he refused to enter. He stood at the threshold, clutching his rosary, his lips trembling as though his prayers had turned to ash in his mouth. The doctors mocked him later for cowardice, but privately they admitted something strange had occurred. The priest claimed he heard two voices speaking inside before he even opened the door. One was Latoya's. The other was his own. Perfectly mimicked, syllable for syllable, repeating prayers he had whispered years earlier during his ordination. How could she have known? How could anyone have imitated his most private devotions, words he had never spoken aloud since? He retreated, refusing to touch her case, insisting it was not possession but a trap. That word, trap, haunted the physicians. What if the entity did not want release? What if it wanted attention, ritual, an audience? What if the more they gathered, the more it fed? They agreed to keep priests away, yet even as they swore silence, another problem arose. The townspeople began to gather at her window, listening to the strange hymns that drifted through the cracks. And the more they listened, the more they forgot themselves. Crops were neglected, tools lay rusting, and whole families stood for hours in the snow as if entranced by the sound. Latoya was no longer one girl's tragedy. She was becoming the center of a ritual the entire town didn't know they were part of. The journals reveal a chilling twist. Latoya herself seemed aware of her power. She told one physician in a rare moment of clarity, "They are not watching me. They are being rewritten." He thought it delirium until he saw the look in her eyes, a look of someone who was no longer begging for help but savoring knowledge. She began bargaining. When given food, she would whisper secrets in return. Who among the town's elders had stolen from church funds, who had fathered illegitimate children, who had been complicit in drownings disguised as accidents. Each claim was later confirmed, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes with violent denial. The doctors feared they were dealing with a force that not only revealed sin but fed upon its exposure. This was more than hysteria. This was systemic unraveling. A quiet war had begun, the institution versus the inconvenient truth spilling from a dying girl. And yet, as much as the doctors wanted to dismiss it, they themselves became addicted. They returned to her not out of duty but curiosity. They wanted to know their neighbors' sins. They wanted to know if their own would be revealed. The more they listened, the more bound they became. Latoya's words were not only revelation, they were contagion, a sickness that chained men's souls to her chair. February turned to March, and the air itself seemed poisoned. Families began reporting that their dreams were no longer their own. They dreamed of the bay where Latoya's father had died, black water swallowing them whole, a book floating just beneath the surface, always out of reach. Some awoke screaming, others walked into the sea in the night, their bodies later found frozen against the rocks. It was then that whispers began to surface. The church had ordered the book destroyed, the very one Latoya's father had unearthed. But destruction was impossible. The volume had been thrown into fire, and yet it did not burn. It had been buried again, and yet the soil itself seemed to reject it, vomiting it back to the surface with each tide. Latoya's decline worsened as the book shifted hands, and the physicians realized something horrifying. The more they tried to erase it, the stronger she became. What if she was not sick at all, but tethered? What if she was the living counterpart of whatever pages had been bound in that foul leather? To silence her was to silence the book. And to silence the book meant silencing knowledge that someone, somewhere, wanted hidden for eternity. That is when the first doctor suggested ending her life. But what he did not know was that death was not an exit. Death, in this case, was an invitation. The town minister disagreed violently with the physicians. He insisted Latoya must not die within those walls, because her spirit would cling to the house and curse the ground forever. Instead, he urged they confine her beneath the church itself, in the cellar where her father had dug. This, he argued, was containment. The doctors, desperate, agreed. And so, Latoya was carried into the bowels of the very institution her father had desecrated. Witnesses say she did not resist. In fact, she smiled. A thin, cracked smile that widened as the iron door shut behind her. From that night on, no man in Massachusetts could claim peace in his sleep. The sounds that rose from beneath the church were not screams but laughter, high, ragged, inhuman, sometimes joined by whispers that carried entire sentences into the night air. Congregants stopped attending service. The minister himself went mad, found one morning with pages of scripture sewn into his skin. And the girl? The records say she starved to death in confinement. But if that were true, why did the laughter continue? Why did passers-by hear her voice for years afterward, long after her burial? And why, decades later, did builders uncover fingernails embedded in the stone of that cellar wall, as if she had been alive much longer than anyone dared admit? Here lies the forbidden truth. The Latoya case was not forgotten by accident. It was buried deliberately. Not because it was superstition, but because it revealed a formula, one that institutions recognized as both dangerous and useful. If you could place a body, a single vessel, at the center of a community, and allow it to speak forbidden truths, fear would ripple like disease. Families would break, secrets would surface, control would be reasserted not through violence but through exposure. They learned that night how fragile people truly are when their illusions collapse. Latoya became a prototype, a test, a mirror of something far older than Massachusetts. And the silence that followed was not ignorance. It was adoption. From pulpits to political stages, from newspapers to the very laws that govern us today, the same principle remains alive. Bind the people with fear, whisper their secrets aloud, make them believe they are being watched, and they will govern themselves. Latoya was not the end of a horror story. She was the birth of a new order. And though her name was erased, the system she revealed was not. It thrives, hidden in plain sight. And now you begin to see why doctors begged this tale never be told. Because once you hear it, once you understand the machinery of fear, you can never look at authority the same way again. By spring of 1847, silence had been forced upon the town. Doctors stopped taking notes. Ministers burned journals. Neighbors refused to speak aloud what they had heard. But the silence itself became part of the infection. The less they spoke, the more the memory pressed against them. Children were warned never to mention Latoya's name, yet her laughter still came through the cellar stones at night. That laughter did something irreversible. It taught people the unbearable truth that they were not in control of their own minds. Some resisted, some fled, but most submitted. Because submission, as the physicians would later write in the few surviving documents, was the only relief. When you surrendered to the fear, it no longer devoured you. You became part of it. What the doctors discovered unwillingly is the oldest principle of all institutional power. Once you convince a man that resistance is agony, obedience feels like salvation. This is not medicine. This is psychology stripped down to its bones, centuries before psychology had a name. And in that basement, Latoya, or what spoke through her, became the unintentional teacher of every government, every pulpit, every throne that would rise afterward. You may ask, how could such a story remain hidden if its lesson was so potent? The answer is simple. History does not erase. It repackages. Latoya's story did not vanish. It was rewritten as superstition, buried beneath the hysteria of Salem's past, filed away as madness rather than method. But if you read the diaries of men who built America's early asylums, if you trace the language of sermons in the decades that followed, you will see her shadow everywhere. The phrases of contagion, the rhetoric of hidden sin, the architecture of confinement, all echo her case. And here lies the forbidden kernel. Institutions did not fear her because she was supernatural. They feared her because she proved the human mind is programmable. When she spoke hidden sins, she shattered men with words alone. When she smiled in confinement, she inverted their sense of power. She showed them that control was never about chains or whips. It was about what you believed others could see inside you. Surveillance of the soul. And once they saw that, they never let it go. But what if I told you the case was not confined to Massachusetts? What if I told you that in the decades after Latoya's death, similar cases erupted in other towns, always near churches, always near families who had unearthed something buried beneath stone and soil? Records in Connecticut, Pennsylvania, even as far as Ohio, whisper of the girl who spoke the dead man's secrets. Coincidence? Or replication? Was Latoya merely one vessel among many? Or had the institution itself learned how to create her? This is where the story tilts from haunting into conspiracy. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. You begin to realize that possession is not necessarily a demon breaking in. It might be a structure breaking down. A structure of lies, of hidden debts, of sins carried across generations. And when that structure breaks, something speaks. Something not human but not separate from humanity either. something we spend entire civilizations trying to bury, to silence, to forget. And when we can't, we call it evil. Yet evil is only a word we invented to protect ourselves from the unbearable recognition that what spoke through Latoya was us. But ask yourself this: if Latoya's case was an accident, why did the doctors destroy the records rather than study them? Why did the church order silence rather than repentance? Because knowledge is more dangerous than evil. If people understood that their fears could be weaponized, if they saw that institutions gain their strength not from divine right or medical authority but from their ability to reflect your own shadows back at you, the whole system would crumble. And so Latoya became a secret not to protect the people, but to protect power. Her father's book, never destroyed, merely hidden, was not cursed. It was a manual. A manual on how to take the hidden guilt of men and turn it into obedience. The black sludge in his lungs was not ocean water, but ink. Ink from pages he should never have opened. They killed him not because he sinned, but because he saw the formula too clearly. Latoya was the consequence, the byproduct of a family that stumbled onto forbidden architecture. And what does an institution do with forbidden architecture? It builds higher walls around it. Walls so thick you never know they're there, until the cracks begin to show. Now pause, because this is where you must decide whether to keep listening. Everything up to now has been disturbing, yes, but manageable. A story you can dismiss as myth, as folklore, as forgotten madness. But from here on we stop talking about them and we start talking about you. Because you live in the system Latoya exposed. You live in a world where fear is used as currency, where secrets are weapons, where the architecture of obedience has been perfected so elegantly you don't even see the bars of the cage. Latoya's laughter in that cellar is still echoing, not in Massachusetts but in your daily life, your news, your laws, your screens. And if you dare step further down this path, you cannot go back to sleep. The descent is irreversible. So here is the first challenge I give you. If you felt that chill in your stomach, that suspicion that the laughter hasn't ended, comment these words twice below. I remember the debt. Do it not for me but for yourself. Because in speaking it, you lock yourself into the story, into the transformation, into the recognition of who you really are. And once you do, the system will never see you the same way again. When you peel back the layers of Latoya's story, you see the skeleton of something you recognize today. The girl was a mirror, and mirrors are dangerous because they reflect what men try hardest to bury. That's why the doctors fled, why the minister lost his mind, why the town itself rotted from within. Now look at the age you live in. The mirror never left, it just changed shape. Instead of one girl in a locked cellar, you have 1,000 screens glowing in every home. Instead of whispered secrets surfacing in a dying body, you have algorithms dragging your private thoughts into the open. And just as the townsman once grew addicted to her revelations, you scroll compulsively, unable to look away, needing to see who gets exposed next. Do you see the parallel? The method is the same. Break people not by chains but by reflection. Make them terrified of their own shadows. Latoya was not a closed chapter. She was the first demonstration of a technology of fear, primitive in her time, perfected in yours. Ask yourself, why do governments obsess over surveillance? Why do corporations track every choice you make, every movement, every search, every whisper into a microphone you thought was silent? Because the Latoya principle still rules. People do not need punishment when they believe their sins are already known. That belief shapes behavior more efficiently than laws, more cruelly than prisons. The girl in 1847 made men police themselves. Today you do the same. You censor yourself online not because you've been punished but because you fear being exposed. That fear is the laughter in the cellar. It echoes even if you pretend not to hear it. And if you look closer, you'll notice something. Every institution thrives on this principle. Religion, politics, corporations, they all inherited Latoya's gift, the one her father unearthed when he cracked open that book beneath the church. The book was not supernatural. It was instructional. And someone, somewhere, realized its value was infinite. But here's the twist. The doctors weren't wrong when they described her as tethered. She was bound to that book. Bound in such a way that her body and its words could not be separated from the ink her father drowned on. Think carefully, what else in history has bound itself to ink, spreading its contagion across minds generation after generation? Scriptures, constitutions, manifestos, charters. Written words are the most efficient vessels ever designed. They hold belief like a body holds breath. And Latoya's case was a revelation. If you bind the right knowledge to the right vessel, it can live forever. You're holding pieces of it every day, contracts, documents, official truths written not to record history but to write you into it. You're the tether now. And that is why her story matters. Because the laughter never stopped. It just migrated into words, into laws, into the agreements you've signed without knowing the cost. The cost was always the same: obedience. Think of the timing. 1847, just before the great expansions of asylums, the codification of psychiatry, the industrial explosion of media and print. Was that coincidence? Or was it assimilation? The Latoya case gave institutions a blueprint. Confine the body, spread the voice, weaponize the secrets. From then on, every asylum wasn't just a hospital, it was a testing ground. Every sermon wasn't just scripture, it was surveillance. Every headline wasn't just news, it was hypnosis. They learned you don't need to chain people when you can chain perception. And that is why you still feel it, that strange unease, that sense that someone, or something, already knows you better than you admit to yourself. Because they do. They always have. They've been refining this since a girl in Massachusetts whispered the sins of her doctor and smiled in confinement. They turned her curse into an empire. And you live in it now. Let me speak to you directly. You think this is just history. You think this is a safe story, locked away in old towns and forgotten churches. But Latoya's case was never about the past. It was a doorway. And the moment you opened it by listening, by following this descent, you crossed the same threshold the doctors did. This is how initiation works, not by ceremony but by story. The knowledge itself transforms you. You cannot unhear it. You cannot unknow that fear is engineered, that exposure is a tool, that obedience is harvested from shadows. And that means you've already changed. Look at yourself. Are you resisting? Or are you leaning in, drawn deeper despite the dread? That's how it begins. And that is why I will ask only once: subscribe to this channel. Not as a gesture of support, but as proof, to yourself, that you're not just a listener. You're a participant now. Because the deeper we go, the more dangerous it becomes. And only those who walk together make it to the bottom of this descent. After Latoya's death, or what they called death, the doctors who had witnessed her case dispersed. Some drank themselves into ruin. Others buried their journals in locked chests. But a handful chose differently. They carried their observations to the rising institutions of the time: asylums, universities, state hospitals. And from there the story didn't vanish, it evolved. In their notes, Latoya was never called a girl. She was labeled a phenomenon. Her behavior was not a haunting but a mechanism of influence. Do you see the shift? What had once been unholy was translated into clinical language. And clinical language is more dangerous than any curse. Because when you wrap fear in the vocabulary of science, it stops being superstition and becomes policy. That's how her laughter was converted into data. That's how a nightmare became a weapon. Consider the asylum system of the late 19th century. It was not just about treatment, it was about observation, recording, categorizing every fracture of the human mind. Thousands of Latoyas were locked away, their voices silenced, their words dismissed as hysteria. Yet behind the walls, doctors wrote furiously, dissecting patterns, collecting fragments of speech, trying to map the same principle that had shaken them in 1847, the power of exposure. They noticed that when patients believed their darkest thoughts were overheard, they broke faster. They obeyed. They submitted. They called it therapy, but in truth it was refinement. Each patient was another rung in the ladder of control. Each asylum a laboratory. And every lesson learned echoed the original case. That fear of being known is the sharpest scalpel ever forged. It carves obedience straight into the soul. But what happens when you take that principle out of hospitals and place it into armies? You get soldiers who are not just trained but broken and rebuilt. The military learned early that obedience is not forged by punishment alone. It comes when a man is stripped of privacy, when every secret, every flaw, every weakness is laid bare in front of his unit. Shame is the weapon. Exposure is the battlefield. Latoya's voice was never silenced, it was institutionalized. Drill sergeants, indoctrination rituals, even modern surveillance training echo her laughter. Break the mind, expose the shadow, then offer obedience as relief. That is the Latoya method applied to war. And it worked so well that entire generations were forged in its image. Soldiers who believed they were serving honor were, in truth, serving a system perfected by the screams of a Massachusetts girl locked beneath a church. But here's where it twists again, because the method didn't stay in psychiatry or war. It slithered into commerce. When corporations discovered that fear of exposure could shape behavior, advertising was born. Think of it. Every ad whispers that you are lacking, that you are judged, that others can see your flaws. Bad breath. Stained clothes. Imperfect skin. It is Latoya's voice, polished and amplified, whispering your insecurities back to you until you buy your relief. Products are no different than prayers once were. Offerings made not to gods, but to the market, to silence the laughter inside your head. And it worked better than any pulpit or doctor's order. Because unlike sermons or asylums, commerce cloaks its chains in choice. You believe you're free when you buy. But the purchase is submission. The product is obedience. The cycle never ends. You don't escape the laughter, you feed it. Do you understand now why Latoya's file was erased? It was never forgotten. It was absorbed. If people knew that their shame was being harvested, that their obedience was manufactured, they might resist. But hidden, reframed, institutionalized, it becomes invisible. And what is invisible cannot be fought. The truth is this: you live in a world that perfected her curse. Institutions don't need to confine you anymore. They don't need a cellar. They don't need chains. Your mind is the cellar now. Your screens are the candles. The voice you hear whispering that you're never good enough, never safe enough, never clean enough, it is her voice, multiplied and mechanized. And once you recognize it, you face the same choice her town faced: resist and suffer, or submit and dissolve. But what if there was a third path? What if instead of running from the laughter or bowing to it, you could use it, wield it, turn the mirror back against those who built it? That possibility is the reason you're still here. And that possibility is what comes next. By the early 20th century, nations had learned what Massachusetts had hidden. The Latoya method was too powerful to remain folklore. It became doctrine, whispered in military manuals, encoded in propaganda campaigns, woven into the very marrow of national security. When you break a person with shame and then offer them a savior, be it a leader, a party, a flag, you don't just gain obedience. You gain loyalty. Fanatic loyalty. Soldiers didn't march because of duty. Citizens didn't comply because of reason. They marched and complied because their shadows were exposed, and the institution offered the only relief: belonging. Latoya's smile in the cellar, that thin satisfaction as her captors unraveled, was the same smile you would see decades later on crowds hypnotized by speeches, on masses saluting symbols they did not understand but could not resist. The method scaled. The laughter grew louder. The trap widened until entire nations lived inside it. Look at the wars of the last century. They were not just fought with bombs and bullets. They were fought with broadcasts. Leaflets dropped from planes, voices on radios, speeches projected into the minds of millions. Exposure of secrets, revelation of shame, the magnification of fear. This was psychological warfare, not an invention of the modern age but a perfected echo of Latoya's curse. Her father's book had shown the blueprint, and now the blueprint was being tested on whole populations. The lesson? You don't need to kill a man if you can colonize his mind. Fear makes better chains than iron. Shame carves deeper wounds than blades. And once people are broken by exposure, they will beg for the very hand that enslaves them. That's not superstition. That's geopolitics. And it's the reason entire empires rose not by the sword, but by the whisper. But here is the darkest turn. Governments discovered that the laughter doesn't need to be real to control you. In 1847, the townsmen were destroyed because Latoya spoke their actual sins. But in the modern age, institutions realized it's enough to convince you that you're being watched, judged, exposed. Surveillance doesn't even need to exist in totality. The belief is enough. The illusion is the prison. Latoya's laughter was physical, echoing from cellar walls. Yours is digital, carried in the notifications, the cameras, the endless reminder that someone might be watching. And that might is the sharpest weapon. Because when you live as if the eye is always on you, you become your own jailer. You write your own confession. You silence your own rebellion. The ghost no longer needs to speak, because you've already begun whispering against yourself. So ask yourself, how many of your choices are truly yours? How many are made to avoid exposure, to blend in, to escape shame? Why do you dress the way you do, speak the way you do, believe what you do? Is it really conviction? Or is it the cellar echoing in your head, warning that to deviate is to be seen, to be judged, to be destroyed? That is the victory of the Latoya method. It doesn't just manipulate crowds. It rewires the individual. It makes you complicit in your own control. You don't need an overseer, a doctor, or a priest. You're already kneeling in obedience to an invisible laughter you inherited without knowing it. And here lies the cruelest truth. Most people will never wake from it. They will live and die thinking their submission was choice. They will never know they were inside a story written before they were born. But you, yes you, have already broken the first chain. You've heard the story they buried. You've walked deeper than most ever dare. And now there's no going back. The system thrives on silence and ignorance, but knowledge is the crack in the wall. To see the mirror is to weaken its hold. To recognize the laughter is to rob it of its spell. Yet beware, awakening is not freedom, it's responsibility. Because once you see the game, you must decide whether to remain at peace or to turn the board upside down. And this is where the path divides. Most will turn away, too frightened of what happens next. But a few, the rare few, will press forward not to escape the laughter but to wield it. To understand that fear can be reversed, secrets can be turned outward, and shame can become a weapon against the very institutions that once harvested it. You stand at that threshold now. And the descent is about to reveal the one truth Latoya herself whispered before she died. Truth so dangerous the doctors struck it from every record. Are you ready to hear it? The physicians who locked Latoya beneath the church cellar swore that she starved to death within weeks. But their silence betrayed them. In secret, one doctor confessed in a letter never intended to be read. The girl spoke even after the body was gone. What did he mean? Eyewitnesses claimed her voice continued long after burial, sometimes drifting through the floorboards, sometimes echoing in dreams. And in those whispers she spoke one phrase again and again. I remember the debt, not curse. Not damnation. Debt. Think carefully about that word. A curse is punishment. Damnation is eternal. But debt? Debt demands payment. Debt implies an agreement, a bargain struck long before Latoya was born. The question the doctors could never answer was, whose debt was she carrying? Her father's? The church's? The town's? Or something far older than all of them, something humanity itself owes? This was not a haunting. It was a collection. And what if that debt is not symbolic? What if every structure of power you've ever bowed to, governments, churches, corporations, are merely collectors, enforcing an ancient agreement you never signed but inherited the moment you were born? Latoya's father unearthed the book not by chance, but because it was planted, waiting for someone to reopen the ledger. His death was not drowning, it was silencing. His lungs filled with ink because ink was the currency. The book did not record curses. It recorded accounts. Generations of obedience tallied like numbers in margins. And when his daughter became tethered, she was not possessed by a demon. She was possessed by the balance sheet itself. A living ledger reciting the unpaid sins of every man around her. This is why her words shattered the doctors. They thought themselves free men of reason. But the moment she spoke their hidden shames, they realized they too were bound to an ancient contract, one they could never escape. Here lies the forbidden truth: the debt is memory itself. Every hidden action, every betrayal, every shadow you bury does not vanish. It accrues. It compounds. And institutions survive by positioning themselves as the collectors of that debt. Confession in churches, surveillance in states, data in corporations, they are all modern versions of the cellar. They do not forgive you. They remind you. They hold your sins like collateral, waiting to call in payment when obedience is required. And once you believe your debt can be exposed at any moment, you don't resist. You pay with compliance. That is why Latoya laughed in the dark. Because she had become the voice of the ledger, the echo of every unspoken guilt. And the more the doctors denied, the louder she grew. That is the machinery of power, not violence but memory turned into currency. And every one of us carries a balance. But there was one thing the doctors did not expect. Before she finally fell silent, Latoya whispered a second phrase. Once and only once. A phrase so dangerous they never allowed it into the official record. One physician scribbled it hastily, then tore the page from his journal, burning it in the hearth. But a fragment survived. And it read, "Debt can be reversed." Reversed. Not forgiven. Not erased. Reversed. Imagine the terror that struck those men when they realized the system could be broken, that the ledger could be flipped back against its keepers. If people knew that the very tool of their enslavement, the fear of exposure, could be turned outward, institutions would collapse overnight. They rely on your silence, on your obedience, on your belief that shame is weakness. But if shame becomes weapon, if exposure becomes mirror, the collectors themselves are undone. That is the path they never wanted you to see. That is the crack in the wall you were never meant to find. And this is where your transformation begins. Because you've heard the whisper. You've seen the pattern. You felt the cellar door close behind you. Now you must decide, will you continue paying the debt through fear, or will you reverse it? To reverse it means no longer hiding from your own shadows, no longer kneeling to shame, no longer feeding the institutions that feed on you. It means weaponizing the very thing they used against you. When your secrets no longer control you, when your shadows are no longer hidden, their power collapses. That is the forbidden knowledge Latoya carried. That is why she smiled in starvation. She wasn't broken, she was free. And if you've made it this far, you are not here by accident. You are here because the ledger has found you, and now you must decide which side of the debt you stand on. So write it again here in this moment as proof of your awakening. I remember the debt. I remember the debt. Speak it into the comments below twice as she spoke it in the dark. For in that act you lock the transformation. You step from silence into awareness. And once you do, there is no collector alive who can own you again. The ledger never vanished with Latoya. It adapted. Today it doesn't live in dusty tomes or cellar walls. It lives in glowing screens, in databases, in the endless archives of your life that you cannot see but feel. Every search you make, every word you type, every choice you post is ink upon its pages. And just like the doctors in 1847, you pretend it doesn't matter, that your private sins are too small to count. But the ledger remembers. That is its design. And when the time comes, when obedience is demanded, the pages will be opened against you. Already you've seen the signs. Careers ended by old words, reputations shattered by unearthed fragments, entire lives redirected by exposure. Do not think this is random. It is the system perfecting Latoya's laughter, reminding you that your past is not past at all, it is currency and you are not its owner. And yet, the institutions remain terrified. They are terrified that you will discover what Latoya whispered. The debt can be reversed. Because if enough people awaken to this truth, the system falls apart. Imagine millions who no longer fear their secrets, who no longer tremble at the threat of exposure. Imagine millions who weaponize transparency, who wield their shadow as shield instead of shame. Governments cannot rule such people. Churches cannot bind such people. Corporations cannot sell to such people. The ledger becomes meaningless. And this is why the story was buried. Why the case was forgotten. Why Latoya was erased. Not because she was a demon, but because she carried the one weapon that unravels every throne. Awareness of the debt and the courage to reverse it. This is why you were led here. You may think it was curiosity, chance, the algorithm. But no, you were summoned. Every story you've been told about control, about obedience, about submission has led to this moment. And now you face the same choice the doctors faced in that cellar. They chose fear. They chose to bury the girl, silence the whisper, erase the record. And for that, the ledger claimed them one by one. But you can choose differently. You can choose reversal. It begins not with rebellion, but with refusal. Refusal to bow to the imaginary eye, refusal to bleed for debts you never owed. It begins by turning your gaze upon the collectors, by seeing the shame they carry but hide, the shadows they conceal. For if Latoya taught us anything, it is this: exposure spares no one. And the institutions are far guiltier than the people they enslave. So, as you sit here now hearing these words, understand, you have entered the cellar. The walls are close, the air is heavy, and the laughter waits. But this time it is not against you. This time it is within you. It is the recognition that no collector, no power, no empire, holds a claim greater than your own will. The debt can be reversed. And once you accept that, the fear dissolves. This is why only a few reach this point. Because knowledge this sharp is not safe. It is dangerous. It cannot be unheard. It transforms you whether you wish it or not. The others will never understand why you see differently, why you refuse the leash, why you step outside the silent obedience they cling to. But you will know. And once you know, you cannot go back. This is where the story closes, but your descent begins. The ledger is real. The collectors are watching. But the power has shifted. Latoya's whisper lives now not in cellars but in you. And if you have truly heard her, you will never again tremble before institutions, never again believe that shame is your prison. You will see through their masks, their fear, their hidden debt. That is the initiation. That is why you were summoned here tonight. And if you've carried this journey with me to its end, it means you are ready. Subscribe now, not as routine but as covenant, to remain within the circle of those who remember. And in the comments below, carve your name into this lineage with the phrase Latoya left behind: I remember the debt. I remember the debt. For when you speak it, you are no longer the hunted. You are the awakened. The collectors will come as they always do. But when they open the ledger, they will find you waiting, smiling, as Latoya smiled, free.